number one, the boards and commissions have a charge to do new rules, and perioperative, post-operative is one of the areas that they want to look at. Number two, I think there was a little bit of a kerfuffle over some of the recommendations, either from the AMDG to the boards or from the HCA in regard to their policy on UR. And it became clear to me, and anybody else can chime in, that this discussion of, the possibility of limiting opioids in some way, either number of pills or number of days in the post-operative period, was sort of much more complicated in a way than the general discussion of acute injuries and stuff like that. So, is that fair to say? And we thought that, it would be useful, given that the boards and commissions are working this thing, and although they're on sort of a more rapid timeline than we can probably accomplish, I thought it would be timely for us to think about updating the 2015 AMDG guidelines section.
There's going to be a lot of non-evidence-based requirements. On the other hand, we have some 2015 acute pain guidelines that are very good, that are very, I think, in some ways, a model for the CDC guideline, at least in the acute pain section. The CDC didn't address perioperative pain at all. Clearly not within their scope. But I think that trying to update the guidelines for perioperative pain would be very reasonable, whether it will meet the quick pace that the rules are necessitating. Essentially, legislation told them, regardless of the science, that they're needed at this date. And we may not be able to meet that date, particularly since the science has just exploded in this area. If we want to make an evidence-based guideline, we're going to need to not be in front of the evidence.
So the other thing I want to mention is that, to me, the opioid guidelines represent kind of recommendations for best practice, based partly on the evidence, but also based partly on the consensus of the experts that were at the table. It's sort of like the, we'll get into this a little bit later, the APS guidelines that Gordon helped co-author with others. There are recommendations in there that are high-level recommendations based on medium to high-level evidence, but there's other recommendations in there that are medium to high-level recommendations based on very low evidence. So a lot of folks are, this is the way people are doing things like this. So, but I do want to focus to the extent possible on our highest level of recommendation based on the best evidence. That would be the strongest suit here. And the other thing to keep in mind, and maybe Blake, you can chime in here, or maybe you could on the rules, which is that the HCA limits was a policy thing related to how utilization review would be done. That wasn't that's not necessarily exactly the same thing as what should most doctors do in terms of best practice. It should be related, but it's not a one-to-one relationship. Similarly, one second, hold on. Similarly, the rules are really aimed at, what's the outside limit? How would an outlier be found wanting, sort of thing? It's not the same. It's not the same as, all the best practices. So I think it's important to keep those differences in mind And what I want to focus on here is not necessarily the rules, but on what the best practices should be. That's our charge. I just want to reiterate that that's what we're doing here. And if there's some way to translate that into the rules, that's another issue. So, David?
Yeah, first, thank you, and I completely support what Greg just stated. We've had a lot of conversations on it. Having chaired the opioid in 2015, we knew the CDC was up to something, and we intentionally did not change, for instance, our dose structure, recognizing that was still unclear, and there was an intentional, we will modify them in the future. So I think intrinsic is now 2+ years out that it's timely to do this. So I think that stands on its own because it's confusing to the community, including Washington State, but elsewhere, why we're not in alliance. Also, the CDC guidelines did call out the MDG guidelines in Paradox. In text, they identified for more information, look to the Washington State guidelines, and there's a direct link to the MDG guidelines. So it was they didn't specify, but they referenced our work as meaningful, important, and an alternative. And my biggest concern is the Department of Health pressure to get their work done, which they're going to do out enacted by January 2019. I see this as a challenge to them to incorporate ours, because the draft that's circulating right now just lifts right out of our guidelines, but it also adds stuff that is incomprehensible to me. Some suggestions that they actually delete completely outside of even our guidelines. So I think it's really important that this Bree and all others here at the table representing this topic give them a standard to use, because I feel that if we can get this done quickly, I don't think it's going to take months to accomplish. If we get this done quickly, we get a direct effect on what DOH rules are. DOH rules are not guidelines, they're the law. And if they're not done right, it's going to be incredibly disruptive to all providers of care in every setting across the state. And fortunately, we are the leader, and everyone's looking to Washington State, so it's our challenge to do this right and get it correct, because it's going to be a hot topic when Washington State pushes the next level. And I'm proud that we're doing it, but we got to get it right.
Thank you for that. Blake, do you have anything you want to say about the timing or anything else that we've talked about?
Sure. Let me just jump in. And first, the 2 points you just made, Gary, I would totally agree with. I think that, with regard to the healthcare authority policy, we've had a lot of kind of conversation about it as we have been working on this project. I mean, we haven't necessarily, the task force, I wouldn't say, has kind of entertained it explicitly, but clearly there has been a lot of conversation about what roles is that playing, what impact does it have on what the boards and commissions are doing. And my personal perspective on it, I would say, is very much aligned with yours, in that I think it is, while it is important to understand what's in the healthcare authority policy, and that we don't want to have something that is, entirely inconsistent with what's there. We also don't want necessarily the reimbursement policy to drive the, what constitutes good patient care. And so that's the, again, we have not had a very explicit conversation about that as a task force. I would be surprised if we are not going to have that at some point. Chris Baumgartner and I have talked about whether or not it merits having a presentation to them from healthcare authorities specifically about it. But what we want to do is we want to make sure that, again, first and foremost, that the rules they reflect good practice. And then, to what extent we can, that those align with reimbursement policy. The other thing I guess I would say is I also agree you know, with the point you were making about making a distinction between what's in rules and what are best practices. And you're absolutely right that rules are the boards and commissions establish really go to what are minimum practices or minimum standards for safe patient care. And that's not the same thing as what best practices are. Now, you know, certainly the boards and commissions are very interested in helping people practice well and practice in a way that's consistent with best practices, but that doesn't necessarily happen through rule. That can happen through the issuance of guidelines or through educational efforts. You know, there's other ways that can be accomplished. And so, you know, clearly there's a lot in the rules that are drafted right now. And, you know, the response that we've gotten back, you know, is pretty much kind of what we expected at this point, because it's really is a draft for discussion. What I'm going to be doing with the task force in the meeting coming up next week is getting a little bit more hard-nosed with them about what, you know, and I made this point at the meeting in Yakima, and I think that part of this is, you know, as you said, you know, I think Greg was saying that a lot of this is stuff that where there is not necessarily always, you know, perfect information. And I think that it's, you know, it's hard for the task force members to come down on a place that they feel is comfortable and supported, you know, in terms of what's not going to represent a shock to the system in terms of patient care. So, but at the same time, they're going to have to sit down and go through these rules line by line, you know, verse by verse, and say, this is something that's enforceable. This is something that represents minimum standards. That is something that over there is something that is a best practice, and that's good information for prescribers to have, but it belongs in a guideline, or it belongs in an educational effort, or, you know, we need to direct prescribers to existing resources like AMDG, like CDC, like Bree. And I think, you know, we've had a lot of conversation about how we accomplish that, how we try and facilitate that discussion in more detail. And what I mean, my personal suspicion is that, you know, there will be a lot less in the rules as they move on than what is in there right now. You know, that they will have to make some hard decisions about what comes out. You know, and you know, there was some discussion at the Spokane meeting about, you know, this kind of this idea that the rules could really just be one page front back. I don't think we're going to get to one page front back, but I do think that we have kind of taken a little bit of the kitchen sink approach to try and put things in front of them with the assumption that they're going to make distinctions about what needs to come out and what can stay in.
So Blake, do you
Does
have
that help?
Yeah, Blake, do you have a comment on the timing? You know, you're kind of on a bullet train. You know, under the you know, in terms of the statute and what the statute asks for, and how long it takes to do rules.
Yeah.
So
I agree with you too about what you were saying about you know, I mean, first let me back up and say, you know, any advice or direction that Bree Collaborative could give us in the area of perioperative prescribing, or you know, any other area related to these rules, you know, we're always going to appreciate. I mean, I think the task force, you know, will gobble that up. But you're right. The challenge right now with these rules is that, you know, as long as it takes to do them, and given the fact that each of these 5 individual board commissions have their own authority, what the task force is really charged with is coming up with a boilerplate that will then go back to each of these 5 boards and commissions. And they, you know, we have to have time at each of those 5 boards and commissions for them to be able to deliberate on that as well, so that they feel comfortable with what would move forward to a CR 102 process. So really what we're talking about is having to have a draft of the boilerplate by about the March meeting, where the last of our 7 workshops is scheduled for middle of March. I think it's March 14th. And our goal, our target, is to have something there that we can at least give to the boards and commissions, and they can start deliberating on, they can start chewing on, they can start thinking about, with a target that they would file their CR 102 packets, which is the kind of the administrative step that you have to go through in order to start the public comment period.
That's the actual rule language. The 102 is the actual rule language. The 102, 101 is just intent to do something. So it's the 102 that has the actual rule language in it. So that's
the formal draft.
That's March.
That's the formal draft.
That's March. Well, what's the date?
Well, March is when we want to have a boilerplate that can go to the 5 boards and commissions.
Right, but when's the 102 due?
Well, we're and some of these boards and commissions meet every 6, 7, 8 weeks. Others meet quarterly. So we've had to leave a little bit of an interval. So what we're assuming is that between March and let's say about June or July, that they will meet and deliberate on whether or not they're okay with it as is, if they feel like there are changes needed, with a goal that we would file that 102, which is the formal draft that starts the public comment period, by say June, July, August. And again, depending a little bit upon where, which meetings are scheduled when. And then we would be looking at doing hearings probably between August and September, depending on when the 102s got filed. So you're really talking about, so the conclusion of hearings would be in the late summer to early fall, with additional work that we have to do in order to prepare the final rule packet for going to the code revisor's office, and that goal would be, with the requirement in the statute is that the rules be adopted by January 1. Now, traditionally, what that's meant is that the adoption occurs and that the rules are implemented. What I am proposing, and I've put this out to the task force to consider, is that we look at trying to get the rules adopted along through late October, November, get them filed with the code revisor's office, but that we allow time between when the rules are adopted and when the rules are actually implemented or effective, if you will, and that would be somewhere between 3 and 6 months. And the reason for that is that my concern is that this is going to be, whatever comes out is going to be a big shock to the system, and that if we just flip the switch and say, okay, these rules are effective on this date, everybody adjust, that there's going to be a tremendous amount of disruption, and that part of what we need to do is we need some time between when the rules are adopted and when the rules actually take effect to help do an education and outreach campaign. Now, whether or not the legislature is really going to feel like that's responsive, or if they're really we want these rules in place, effective by the first of the year, that's something we're still trying to get a read on. And, but I'm certainly trying to put out there that I think there's value in allowing ourselves that period of time for adjustment and for education and for getting the word out.
So importantly for this group's work, it sounds like if we got something done, even preliminarily, say by March, I think we could do that.
It wouldn't be too late.
It wouldn't be too late.
Yeah, it wouldn't be too late. We could.
So that's the important.
I
think that's good because watching the superficially the timeline, your kind of quick stuff. It looked to us like you might have needed something before then, but it looks like that would be okay. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. And one of the things that we've talked about as well is, as I said, the 5 boards and commissions are going to look at these rules, and they may decide that they want to make some tweaks. I mean, we certainly want them to be as consistent as possible across all 5 sets of rules, but it's always possible that they may want to make individual changes. And one of the things we've talked about is that we may even want to have a final 8th meeting of the task force, say in late spring. So let's say, May, latter part of May, for example, after they've had a chance to look at them, so that if there are discrepancies, so if different boards and commissions have gone away and they've made little changes, or even, more moderate changes, which we're hoping they won't do, that there will be a forum that they can come back together and talk about, we've identified this and here's the rationale. And so I could see that a meeting like that might also be an opportunity, even if, like you say, if you had something preliminarily by March, that would be great. But even if there's a later meeting like that in May, that would be an opportunity to provide, a little bit more.
Okay, we need to kind of move along here, but just one more point on this difference between the sort of enforcement role of the rules versus these best practices that are embodied in these guidelines. I've always sort of wondered, you try to put very specific things in the rules, for the enforcement piece, but what you're really looking for is in my experience, our bad guys at O&I, they stick out like a sore thumb. It doesn't really take necessarily going, well, he didn't meet that one or didn't meet this one. It's like 90% of the time he's not doing any of this stuff. And right. I'm just wondering if the rules would be sort of, good enough to reference the fact that these guidelines represent the best practices in Washington, plus, maybe the CDC, whatever. But, if a guy's most of the time not doing most of these things, that's not good. So I don't know if there's a way to address the rules in that way, which is not exactly the same thing as you're doing now, which is very specific things.
Enforcement.
Yeah.
Right. No, and I think that they're going to move that direction. I mean, and frankly, it's my hope that they move that direction. A couple of quick things about the meeting we're having next week. For one thing, we're having our regulatory affairs manager from the department come and talk about the rulemaking process. And part of what I'm asking her to emphasize is, again, the idea that they are enforceable and that there's a difference between, minimum standards and what you put in rule, and the intent of putting it in rule is that you intend to enforce it, versus other things that are, really necessary for good patient care. And I agree with what you're saying, that a lot of people out there, if you're substantively, adhering to best practices, but you're not necessarily doing every single little thing, that's very different than if you're just blowing it all off and you're not doing any of it, and those are clearly the bad actors. The other thing we have is one of our ADQ prosecutors.
Blake, hold on. But I don't think the way we have typically done rules has actually made it easy to look at it like that.
May I comment, Karen?
Right.
So why don't you let him finish, and then why don't you let him finish his thought, and then we'll come to you. Go ahead, Blake. You want to finish your thought?
Well,
again, I just, one of the things, and even though these members of the task force, have worked on rules, we work on rules all the time on the individual boards and commissions, so they're familiar with that. I think this is something where the stakes are very high, and it is very important that that they understand the potential for creating problems if they put too many shoulds, if you will, rather than shalls, into the rules, and what the potential implications are of creating a lot of hassles and a lot of technical things that are going to trip people up. So the other thing we're doing is we're going to have.
But you can put language in, like, most prescribers should follow the best practices as embodied in these guidelines or whatever, 80 to 90% of the time. And if they're hardly ever doing that, that's a serious problem. So, but
and that's one of the things is we're going to have one of our prosecutors come and talk about, kind of what's enforceable versus, when she's prosecuting cases, what does she look for, and I think that's part of the calculus that she does is, like you say, if there's things that people should be doing and by and large they are doing them, they're adhering to them, then that we can't necessarily legislate that every single case and every single time somebody issues an opioid prescription, what it's going to look like and what is going to happen. So I think that's the horns of the dilemma that they're going to land on.
The other dilemma is, we've got people sitting at the table here and on the phone who are national experts in this stuff, the best people in the country, and whatever we come up with is going to represent that expertise and the ability to translate evidence and expert opinion into something real, something meaningful. And there's got to be a way to clearly translate that, at your level. So David Talbot had another...
Just 3 quick points. So having lived through the 2010 rollout, this flashback of that.
He still got PTSD from
No. I thought it was... But the solution was really magnificent, so it's a compliment to what was done before. If that could be duplicated. So one was that there was, I think it was called an interpretive statement that was actually the Medical Society and the Hospital Association said, explain what you mean. And this long conversation we just had was 1 page, wonderful, reducing the temperature, explaining what the intent is. It's not to disrupt care. It recognizes variations in practice. It gave the language that provided the reassurance by all the key players, stakeholders, that this is not a catastrophe, that you can go on and make clinical judgments. Every patient is unique, and you trust your clinical judgment. That's where your license will stay. So, interpretive statement, I don't know, is that what it was called? Something like that. The other is, and this is repeated, in my experience, I've been speaking at national level, and I advocate guideline adherence, and I just get murdered by the practitioners, because with all due deference, guidelines are interpreted as the law. Because if there's a bad outcome, the practitioners are convinced they're going to be sued. Now, they may or may not. So I like the prosecutor's comment that we're going to get a look at that. But this prosecutor may not be the prosecutor in 6 months. I think it's important to recognize that even though, yes, guidelines are guidelines, but if you're not following guidelines and your patient has a bad outcome, you're going to have a tough time defending yourself.
Yeah, but I'm differentiating between the person who, in some cases, for some specific reason that is documented, don't follow whatever. There are folks out there that have been saying that almost never follow those guidelines. And I can tell you, looking at a lot of these cases at LNI, that's what we see. So I think having some way in here to differentiate mostly never doing stuff or hardly ever doing stuff versus sort of doing stuff from time to time in various cases and documenting the reason for that. So that shouldn't be rocket science to do it that way.
That was the should and the shalls.
Yeah.
So should means best practice, it's okay, you have to justify. Shall is you shall. It's an absolute. So the more shoulds where we get into the gray zones, the better, and that was another really nice job with the final writing of the rules. I initially said, wow.
And I agree with you too, that I think that there are cases, there are situations in these rules where we can say, this is what, we're saying should be the care, but, exceptions are appropriate with documentation in the patient record. I don't think there's any, I mean, personally, I don't think there's anything wrong with having those in there, and some people kind of poo-poo it and say that kind of approach and say you can't build an exception into the rule, and I say, well, we do that all the time. So I think that it is possible to do those sorts of things as well, and so that's going to be part of how we wordsmith this with the task force.
Yeah, so I think we need to move on from this. Greg, do you want to say one last thing?
Well, I just, one of the things, Blake, that really bothers me about the rules, there is a difference between, whether practitioners think there's a difference between rules and guidelines. But today we could come up with a guideline, and next week we could come up with a completely different guideline, and it wouldn't be a big deal. It would be easy to switch that and, oh, well, this is the most recent guideline. Try doing that with once they're legislated rules.
Right.
Wasn't it, there was some question even if we wanted to change the 120, how easy would it be to strike it out of the legislation that's already been passed. There was some talk about having to go back to lawyers and changing those. My point is not that. My point is those 2011 rules were based on 2007 guidelines. And we knew that there weren't going to be a whole lot of unintended consequences because we'd already done it. And I think it's a big mistake for us to come to some sort of specific suggestions here in our guidelines in the next 3 months and then have them put into state rules a week later. I really think that we need to be, what goes into the rules should be based on the really good work that we did, but have had a couple of years to look and see that there were no bad unintended consequences. But I realize that the rules is a separate issue. Here we want to make guidelines that are right up to date with people's opinion and with the literature.
Right.
But I think if we take that and immediately put it into a rule, we may be sorry, because it's not easy to change those rules. As you just described, all the things you have to do to get the rules implemented.
Yeah.
And then so...
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, I agree with you. We want to retain the maximum amount of flexibility that we can, because if we start... like you say, and it goes back to your point earlier about, if we're overdriving our headlights here and we put something in rule, then, if there's a terrible set of unintended consequences as a result of that, it's not easy to fix.
So I want to set we're going to move on. We need to move
get back
on.
to guidelines,
What?
paper rules.
Well, yeah, we're going back to what our task is, which is to amend the 2015 AMDG guidelines in the perioperative section. And I did take some time to prepare some slides. I promise you I will not be doing this at every meeting. I think we mostly need to deliberate, but it's going to be important. As Greg said, there's a lot of new stuff out there in the literature. There's probably, at least 20 or 30 pretty decent new papers out just in the past 3 years. Not the least of which is Deb Gordon's APS, research gaps and guidelines, 2 different papers. So what I wanted to do today was just kind of set the table with kind of what do we know and some, questions about the directions we might head in or not. Just leaving it completely open. So I'm just going to go through these. The people on the line,
They should be able to see it.
they can see it. Okay. So I just wanted to first go through a little stuff. The AMDG was asked to present to the boards and commissions back in September, and I just want to go through a little of that stuff. Without there's no assumption here of any of that moving forward. I just wanted to show you what we said back then. So first of all, the new rules, and this is probably going to be continue to be true. Chime in, Blake, if this is wrong. will continue to not apply to palliative, hospice, or end-of-life care. So, we're only talking about, in the past, rules around chronic prescribing, and now we're talking about acute and post-operative prescribing. The focus in the new rules is on preventing the next cohort of our citizens from getting into trouble from even acute opioids or subacute opioids. And to consider continuing education to increase awareness of effective pain management, to update existing pain management rules, and to add new rules on topics like we're talking about here. This is just what we said back then. This is a slide that shows, this is from the National Institute of Drug Abuse, that shows who's prescribing what and at what age. And what you can see here is that the baby blue lines are dentists. They prescribing a large amount of opioid in our younger people. And then if you look at the adults from, say, 25 on, you can see that primary care, emergency rooms are a big prescriber. But one interesting thing that has come out in other studies as well is that surgery, in this case orthopedic surgery, increases with age. So that the amount of perioperative opioid prescribing that's going on in surgical specialties increases with age. And I think there's some other data that are actually showing that the perioperative, post-operative problem, if there is a problem, is probably a little more acute in older people than it is in younger people. And, it's just something to pay attention to here. This is a slide showing acute opioid prescribing in adults by specialty. This is from the Prescription Drug Monitoring Program. I believe the Department of Health put this data out. But here you can see, I think this was between July 1st and December 31st of 2015, so it was just 6 months of data. And it shows the number of patients and the mean number of pills and the median number of pills and the 75th and 90th and 99th percentiles of the number of pills. And it's just very interesting to look at this because, for example, if you look at the dental stuff, the median number of pills was 16, the mean's about the same, but the 75th percentile and the 90th percentile goes up a little bit. But if you look at orthopedic surgery, the mean and median number of pills are 25 to 28, but the 75th percentile goes up to 60 and then 80 and then 150 pills at the 99th percentile. So there's kind of a tail on some of the prescribing from some of the providers. There's sort of a lot of variation, shall we say, in prescribing or in some of these specialties. And the same thing is true in some of the other surgical specialties. This is a slide that I'm pretty sure Greg hates, but it's from the CDC. Dr. Shaw and others published this like 4 or 5 months ago. And this looked at, it's not adjusted for anything, it just looked at what is the relationship between the number of days of the first prescription and the relationship between that and the probability of still being on opioids a year later or 3 years later. And what they showed was that the probability of being on opioids long term goes up by 1% per day, starting with the 3rd day of prescription. The difference between 3 days and 10 days is the difference between 6% being on opioids a year later and 14% being on opioids a year later. So just a little more opioid actually increases the risk quite a bit. And then the 2015 AMDG opioid guideline, which I believe we handed out here, is that right?
They have that section.
The section on perioperative pain. And this slide just summarizes, as Greg said, I think these were great recommendations back then. Number one is there should be a pre-op assessment, including checking the prescription drug program in regard to fitness for surgery. Do not discharge the patient with more than a 2-week supply of opioids. This was the 14-day kind of thing in here. And many surgeries may require less. Continued opioid therapy will require appropriate reevaluation by the surgeon. Avoid new prescriptions of benzos, sedative hypnotics, anxiolytics, or CNS depressants. The people on chronic opioid therapy pre-op should be down to the pre-op dose or lower by 6 weeks after the surgery. I thought that was a pretty good sort of thing. But opioid naive patients who are opioid naive pre-op should be completely tapered by 6 weeks. So there was the 14-day thing in terms of the initial prescription, and don't go beyond 6 weeks at the outside. So does anybody have any comment on that? Greg, you worked on this. Anybody have anything else to say here? This is just a quick summary.
So the 2
here.
weeks had to do with trying to get them back to see the surgeon, to reevaluate. And I know that's difficult in situations where people have to travel. We talked about that quite a bit. How difficult it might be to get them back to see their surgeon. Because the underlying assumption was that for most patients, the surgeons would be in charge of their prescribing in the initial post-op period.
And there was other stuff, I didn't put everything on the slide, but there was other stuff in there about whose responsibility it is, et cetera.
Communication among the team is to
Right.
up front knowing exactly who is going to be prescribing, so that there aren't several prescribers that are taking over.
Right, so there was a lot of good stuff in there on this. There was a lot of good stuff in the APS guideline on
Yeah, I
this.
just
Deb,
wanted
you
to
have
add, I mean, 2 weeks I thought was brilliant, and it was not in the APS guideline, but there was some literature at the time, and I think there's more, that 2 weeks seems to be kind of one of those critical cut points for trajectories. If people are using opioids or having significant problems with pain at the 2-week mark, there's probably something going on with getting into the long-term use trajectory
or a complication of
or
surgery.
something. So 2 weeks, I think, still seems like a really good thing.
I want to just reiterate what we heard earlier, a shock to the system. And when I'm speaking about it, it's not the physicians, it's the patients. And if they have to travel within 5 days or 7 days across the state, post-op, who know what they've had done, it's actually, I would consider untenable and inappropriate for many patients. So we're not advocating that the doctors get off easy. We're saying that the patients just simply cannot tolerate that. We had a long discussion on this 2 weeks ago because we didn't have that particular data. But it was a sense of the reality of practice in the state, which is urban centers, which are hard to get. What about rural Washington? Which is asking, how do you get this to an urban hospital, just to get a refill of the opioids? They do need to see a doc. So we said 2 weeks would be enough to be able to organize the forces, enough healing in place, and can be mobilized. So this was a patient-centered decision, not a physician-centered decision. I think we should highlight that.
So as Greg has said many times, I think this was a great effort. These are really good recommendations. I think really reasonable. And the question is whether anything that's been published since then, which is quite a bit, as we said, is compelling enough to add stuff to that, and what would that be? So let's move ahead here. This is just, so these were recommendations that we put on the table for acute prescribing when we talked to the boards in September, and we took a shot at, some generalities about, how many pills or how many days, whatever. I don't want to get into that too much here. Whoops. Okay. So the question really on the table here for us is, in addition to what's already in there, and we're talking about amending that section, should we consider any kind of numbers of pills of other duration recommendations? That's really the question, and I think the main reason to consider that is that the amount of pills left over in most situations, at least as far as how people have done it until now, is huge. The number of pills left over is on the order of 80 or 90% of pills. So no matter which paper you look at, there's 2 papers on this slide, one which was in pediatrics, so these were leftover pills, be it in kids, followed by parent diaries, which I thought was pretty interesting. And they did this sort of prospectively, and they looked at TNAs, and they look at musculoskeletal procedures. These are all procedures, and then minor abdominal, GU, or other peripheral procedures. So for tonsillectomies, for example, 52 pills on average were dispensed, 44 pills were left by day 4. And these were all sort of by day 4 type of things. And then the Sun paper brings up other issues. This is the group from Stanford, that Sean Mackey's group, that was looking at, what are the risk factors for chronic opioid use. And again, there's a number of these kind of papers out there now. Can you predict who might end up, for persistent opioids, even if they're opioid naive when they come into the surgery? And some of the risk factors they came up with were number 1, men, but number 2, which caught my eye, was elderly seem particularly vulnerable to end up on chronic opioids after surgery. Which I didn't really know this stuff. And if you look back at that NIDA slide of the orthopedic numbers going up with age, I thought it was pretty interesting.
Can I just interrupt? So the thing that I've always struggled with this is that 2 weeks supply might be 14 tablets, right? It's opioid use for 2 weeks. It doesn't mean like, okay, so the maximum possible is every 3 hours is 10 milligrams is 60 tablets a day or a week. So it's very difficult, I think, when we get to these numbers, because if you talk to people who've had joint replacements, they may only need an opioid once a day before their physical therapy, or twice a day, maybe in the evening when their pain is more flared as they're trying to get to sleep, or with their activity. So, the pill count doesn't necessarily equate the length of time they need to be on an opioid at some point during the day. So that's where I think this really, I would agree that a lot of people probably should go out the door with no pills, or 5 pills, or 10 pills. But that might be 2 weeks for them.
So that's a great point, but that's a little different point that we should get to as to what people really need. And that's not what I'm talking about here. What I'm talking about here is, on average, in general, the recent literature is showing that and this is the public health problem, is the amount left over, and that probably is quite available in many cases for subsequent misuse or diversion or anything else. That's the sort of population public health problem. And what we're talking about, I think what we're really talking about here, I don't think anybody would dispute this stuff, is the balance of the need of solving the public health problem on the opioid crisis with getting people what they need, what they really need. And so I think that's what we're really going to be hammering through here as we're moving forward in regard to specific new recommendations we might be making. And I agree completely with what you said, but it's just like another area that we need to talk about.
Two quick comments. So the language in many have said about the excess pills in orthopedic prescribing populations, they're calling it a reservoir of opioids left over. That the follow-up surgeries don't even need opioids. So the term reservoir actually, I think, is a powerful metaphor. That it's just backed up in the community, which then overflows and causes the flood of opioids that was published in the New England Journal in 2010. So I think that just to reinforce for those not in the middle of this epidemic here, watching it. I would challenge over-interpretation of the Stanford Gough data. Yes, man, we just had an expert, a couple of University of Iowa, has been working on this, and actually it's very difficult to predict in anticipation, so male gender may not particularly apply.
Yeah, I'm not sure about the male part. I am pretty sure about the elderly part.
Well, elderly in part, and again, the orthopedists in the age groups, that's because they're doing joint replacement surgeries. So
I understand.
It's a tautology that they're going to be prescribing.
But there's another thing I want to show a little later related to this also.
You'll figure out how to put this in here.
I don't know what the hell's going on here. So we talked about this in regard to the work we did on dental prescribing. There's just some data out there. Most of the heroin increase in heroin deaths is occurring in 18 to 30-year-olds. And so you got to be concerned about what is happening and prescribing to younger people. What they showed in this study was these are surveys they do. These have years of funding when these studies here doing prospective stuff. They showed that in a cohort of 12th graders who got a single prescription, getting a single prescription in high school was associated with a 33% increase in risk of those same kids misusing opioids between 18 and 23. So, they got their prescription before 18 or so, and then in the next few years, there was a lot of misuse of those same pills. Do you know what's happening here?
There might be a button that takes it all the way to the end.
What? Maybe I just pushed it too hard. Maybe that was it. This is more stuff on, how many, another study, a number of studies have looked at, how much of this stuff is being used, and then what is the risk of persistent opioid use? That is the question. And I think this is one of the more interesting studies I've seen recently that looked at what the percent of persistence. I can't remember what what they define as persistence. It's been all over the map. Some people have said 3 months, whatever. But whatever the definition, and it's important for us to nail this down. But for the purposes of today's discussion, this is 90 days. So that's pretty common. The degree of the percent of the prevalence or the incidence, should say, of persistent opioid use. These are in opioid naive patients when they came into surgery, is on the order of 6%, maybe a little bit more than that. And there was no difference in the incidence of persistence between minor surgeries and major surgeries. There are other studies, however, that differentiate real issues on persistence and need for opioids, particularly in thoracic surgery and abdominal surgery. There's a bunch of stuff out there. I think you called some of that out in the APS guideline and stuff. So I think we got to put all this stuff together. Taken together, I think you can come up with some conclusions about the fact that I think we would all agree that new persistent opioid use could be a problem. But we have to be careful that we're sorting out, which patients still may have ongoing pain that requires treatment. And then the other thing on this is that the amount of preoperative opioid use, how much preoperative opioids, whether it was chronic or not, actually is also a strong predictor of postoperative persistence and expenditure in general. So that we haven't talked about money here, and we're not going to talk about money, I don't think, on any other slide. But it is sort of interesting that if you come into surgery on chronic opioid therapy, or what your dose is, or how long you've been doing it, has a relationship to how the risk of subsequent persistence and subsequent expenditures in general, in medical expenditures. So I thought the Dartmouth studies were pretty interesting in that the surgeons at Dartmouth thought that same thing, there's a lot of this stuff left over. Could surgeons be taught to alter the way they're prescribing, to reduce the number of pills they're giving people? And they wanted to try to come up with some numbers as to, about how many pills would 80% of people need for, say, 5 common elective surgeries. And the number of pills they came up with was, for most of the surgeries was like 5, 10, or 15 pills. And again, this doesn't answer the question about identifying the outliers or identifying, say, the thoracic patient that's left with a lot of, neuropathic pain. That's the other thing, by the way, I think the literature speaks to, is a lot of the persistent pain, maybe up to half, is neuropathic. And that is another...
So let me, glad you mentioned that, because that's exactly a concern that I have. Is that part of this chronic opioid prescribing may in fact be the old problem that people are giving opiates for any pain complaint, no matter how chronic.
Or the source of it.
And so, if you look at this new data about chronic opioid use, it's very reminiscent of some previous data in the pain world about how many people have chronic pain after surgery. So there's a lot of people who have chronic pain. Either it doesn't go away after surgery, or it's actually new after surgery because of the insult that takes place. And so none of that was taken into account in any of these epidemiology studies about, they don't know why the patient's taking opioids. They don't know if they've got pain, they don't know if they've got addiction, although it seems like these days, everyone that's on opiates for a year must, by definition, be addicted. That's not true, and it never has been.
But it is true that if you're on opioids beyond a certain period, probably not that long, you are dependent, you will have trouble getting off, even if you want to get off. But I think your neuropathic point, and I think the APS guidelines spoke to this a little bit, might also mean the multimodal care with some neuropathic type treatments, not necessarily opioids, might also be considered.
Absolutely. I'm not suggesting that they're being treated appropriately in a year for their pain.
Right.
If that's the
So
reason.
I think it's really important to try to sort that part of this out, like how much of this persistent pain maybe is neuropathic or some other kind of pain for which the treatment so far has not been that appropriate, or the best treatment you could get.
Without further
One comment on
examination.
This is an academic medical center, the electronic health record, Dartmouth, and one of the first in the world who introduced electronic health record. These are order sets. This is the low-hanging fruit. It's just change the order set because the residents, my residents, they click the button, the order set, the default comes up, and they discharge without amount. So a
You're
little.
suggesting that education
I
maybe
think
a bit
education, they play a big role. Yeah.
maybe a little bit optimistic there. That's not really education. It's just changing the.
Well, that's how residents get educated.
Oh,
They look at what the experts have put into the order set. I mean, that's how I learned when I was a resident. What is the default? Well, that's the heparin order does. I mean, some of us recognize colleagues who trained in my era, and what's the paper sheet? What's the heparin dose? That's the standard. That's what I'm going to use. If the standard is 100, 150, or 5, that's a significant difference. And that's where the healthcare authority, the utilization review for prescribing is going to have easy impact. We elaborate. Easy impact, big impact, change the order sets. University of Washington changed the order sets. It took, I forgot that happened in 6 weeks, but they changed the EPIC order set, and you're going to transform care. So it's not even education, it's educating the people who write the order sets. And then the vast majority, and these are the future workforce that's going to be prescribing this.
Unfortunately, some of the people who went up to 30 should really, they went up to 30 instead of down to 30, right? Because it's the order sets, right?
Ivan, did you have a point?
Well, I think the one thing that's interesting, and I think Greg mentioned, alluded to, is sort of what we see in the chronic pain world is the adoption of a biopsychosocial model and trying to understand pain. And I would argue that in this presentation, the further we get out from a clear nociceptive insult, the more we need to focus on the biopsycho components of understanding the etiology of pain. And that, at least from the trauma population, you look at persistent prescribing of opiate, has a large factor in determining persistence and prescribing across all populations. So I think I look at it as dynamic, and it supports what you're suggesting. The further we get out from prescribing, when we start seeing this, we really need to start looking a little further at understanding the etiology of the pain, things that reinforce it.
It might be good to screen for psychosocial barriers to recovery before surgery.
There you go.
You know, for example.
Well, there you go. I think that's...
And we're kind of doing that in workers' comp in terms of early injuries, not surgery. But there's no question that the biggest predictors of chronic pain, of the transition from acute to chronic pain, not whether you include opioids or not, are biopsychosocial barriers to recovery.
Biological, obesity, and other characteristics. The problem is, this is an evolving science. I don't know what Greg was saying.
Those have psychosocial components to them, often very prominent ones.
It's very, very difficult to determine what those particular are. And so I think we're going to figure this out over the next several years, but we don't quite know it yet. And that's why Greg's point about putting this.
You don't know it in regard to certain post-op?
Yeah.
Okay. But we do know it in regard to the transition to chronic pain in like musculoskeletal injuries. We do know that. It's pretty. Okay, we're not going to argue right now. So, and by the way, if anybody's interested, in all the papers that anybody identified as being reasonable are all in the Dropbox. And one thing I did to prepare for today is to go through almost all of those. But I would encourage everyone in the work group who is interested in the actual new information in the past few years to go in and take a look at some of those papers, including the APS guidelines.
It's a nice collection that you have.
Thank you. So, and then this was again the Hill study of how many pills. This was sort of interesting. This was I am cherry picking here a little bit. Opioids after inguinal hernia repair, the myelonus in surgery in November 2017. This is a prospective observational study, and only a single surgeon at Mass General in a high volume practice. 185 patients. The majority of his patients reported they did not require any opioid analgesics, and nearly all of those who thought they did use less than 5 pills. So this was just, I guess would you call a herniorrhaphy a more minor surgery? Would you call it that?
Should be, unless it's
Yeah.
Starts off that way.
Yeah.
But there is a fair amount of neuropathic pain.
Long-term, correct, absolutely, one of the more likely presentations for neuropathy.
So that's why I say.
Right, so we've seen
Try
that.
to distinguish between minor and major. Minor is someone else's surgery.
Yeah, so I'm not trying to do that. I'm sorry I used that terminology. But you've brought up the major surgery, often like the Whipple procedure. But
Yes.
I do think it's important to keep all this stuff in mind. So this, I went through the Deb's work in the APS guideline with a bit of a fine-tooth comb, and I tried to pull out all of the recommendations that were strong recommendations and that had high or moderate quality evidence as being kind of possibly things we might want to think about. Now, the things here that are mostly anesthesia type things, not really opioid, they could all end up being opioid sparing. A lot of them could end up being opioid sparing, but I'm not saying we want to, get into kind of the anesthesia part of making recommendations, because maybe that's beyond the scope. We might want to have a table in here that actually highlights some of these recommendations, even if this amendment to our 2015 post-op opioid thing, doesn't directly address all the evidence on these things. But I thought these were really interesting things. I really like the issue of use of multimodal regimens, oral over IV opioids, avoid the IM route, use PCA when parenteral is needed, provide Tylenol or NSAIDs post-op if no contraindications. This is kind of what happened in the dental guideline. In that case, it was use those first. A pre-op dose of celecoxib if no contraindications. I'd like to hear more about that. That looked like pretty strong evidence on that. Gabapentin or pregabalin is part of multimodal, especially if there's a risk of neuropathic pain.
Just a quick comment, just the timelines are moving. I absolutely recommend this. Some recent data is actually being called out of the question. So,
Which thing?
the gabapentin to be as effective as the earlier studies. So this is getting into rules what we're still figuring out. This is a Greg's earlier comment. We think we're behind the horse on this one, but data may suggest we're maybe just on the horse right now. And to undo this, it's hard to imagine why we wouldn't put that. That's an example of evolving data. We don't have this now down yet.
Right, but the question is, for this discussion, is whether any of this might or might not end up on our amendment on the opioid piece. Surgical site-specific regional anesthetic techniques seem to have high evidence and seem very effective. And then neuroaxial analgesia for major thoracic and abdominal procedures. And since those procedures seem to leave relatively more people with worse pain afterwards, some of which is neuropathic, whether that might be related to preventing some of that from happening.
So this is, again, is a regional disparity in access to that technique in terms of a sophisticated acute pain service at an academic medical center versus in Wenatchee Valley Community Hospital.
So Deb, do you want to say anything about,
I mean, I
I
would say
did pull
that,
these out.
I mean, it's worth noting that, APS contracted with Roger Chow's Oregon Health Sciences Evidence-Based Center. This took about 5 or 6 years, actually. The evidence review was updated 3 times. Roger Chow said it was the most overwhelming evidence review their center had ever done, and that they would never finish, and they just had to stop with what they did. It had over 800 primary and randomized controlled trials and about 100 systematic meta-analysis, and it still was full of holes. So it's not a lot of evidence really to be really specific.
But your gap paper was a nice
The gap
combination.
paper showed where there needs for more research, and I think the federal acute pain research strategy reinforces that in more detail. But I think I was just at the National Quality Forum's Opioid Action Stewardship Team meeting in DC last month, and I think part of the solution to the opioid epidemic is better communication. So I think that's what we need to say, is you need to do multimodal, balanced, rational,
With the
perioperative pain management.
And that was true even without the
Yeah. Yeah, so
opioid
don't- you don't need all
scare.
that detail.
Right, but that's the
Even
goal.
without the opioid.
Better pain management will
Opioids
take
have a
away
lot of
the,
side effects.
whether it's an emotional response.
Absent here, though, is Dad is fond to comment on, is the non-pharmacologic modalities, which I know have strong recs, but low to quality evidence, but from a risk-benefit perspective, so we can't forget the non-pharmacological.
Yeah, I was trying to be a little careful here about which things I brought up,
Yeah.
as I kind of focused mostly on the things that were high, pretty much, because they were pretty solid. I think those were the most solid things.
So Gary, you don't want to talk about costs. May I please bring up all the stuff, Deb, none of her work is compensated. She's doing it, now she's paid for her work, but there's no funding mechanism existing in the current healthcare system that supports much of the current recommendations. So the multimodal regimens that are non-pharmacological are essentially not supported by any insurance payer. So they're just, again, this, I'm not saying says we don't recommend it, but this is, the cart is ahead of the horse on this one. We say it should be done, but the health people of the Washington State Hospital Association, which I'm not a member, they would say, this is great, but we have no way of providing the service and staying in the black. So we just need to be mindful of that as a concern when we make recommendations. I get pushback when I talk about this nationally. This is great, fabulous, I get it, but my health system doesn't have it. You're going to make me do something that not only is new and changing, but there's no system of care delivery or funding mechanism.
Right, but this,
Well,
for example, this biopsychosocial point, once opioids became easy to use in the early 2000s, most insurance companies stopped paying for all that stuff. Most of them didn't pay for it much before, but they mostly stopped paying for it after that happened, and it was, it was pretty bad.
This is also, the audience is beyond just prescribing providers, right? This is also directing nursing practice. So I think that, I understand what you're saying, but the ability for a nurse to use an ice pack as a standard part of recommendation for post-operative management shouldn't place the hospital in any sort of extremis in regards to funding. So the ability to mobilize and use distraction tools to address concerns and work on sleep hygiene should not put the hospital in any great extreme in cost. So I suggest if we're audiences beyond just physicians for practice, we should consider those type of low-hanging fruit that I think you would say has fairly, maybe not the strongest evidence, but highly recommended because of its
Yeah, so, I think we should keep that in mind. We do need to move on here and finish up and take some direction for the next steps here, if you don't mind. So, when we met, I met with a smaller group from the U, and we talked about some other opportunities that might be here for work that this group might do after this is done, and because there are other considerations related to the dose threshold we've talked about a lot, and then these special populations, especially geriatric women and children. those sections of the 2015 guidelines could possibly stand to be updated. And then this is a study that, to my last slide, that looked at, I was sort of shocked by this. This is, I can't remember who published this, but it's overdose poisoning rates in various states in the elderly. And Oregon and Washington are at the top of the list for the very high rates of opioid poisoning in the elderly. And this is kind of what got me all juiced up around some of the information that we were seeing in the literature related to the post-op area and the elderly. So this is the kind of thing, when I see this kind of thing, it really, makes me want to do something. And I think, doing some, updating the geriatric piece, special population part of the 2015 guideline would, I would vote on that as something to do here in this group. So we have.
So this is, I think, if I recall correctly, opiate-related hospital stays. So this is.
I'm sorry, these were not deaths, these were hospitalizations.
And so this includes not just opioids too. So if you ended up being admitted into the hospital because you had a heroin overdose, you're counting those.
That's
so
right.
This.
Right.
This is not prescription drug.
This is all.
This is all.
That's right.
It's still horrible numbers, but
yeah,
I think we had to pay attention to it.
But I don't think there's a lot of heroin being used in the elderly, honestly. There's some probably, but it's the increase in heroin is primarily in the 18 to 30-year-olds. So I don't think that's really that huge here. So anyway, that's the presentation. I'd like to open the floor for comment, or what I think we should do is maybe Greg and I could take a shot at just and Deb and Dave updating the lit review description from the 2015 guideline to just talk about what do we know now that we didn't know then. Just to, all the papers are there. Some of them are similar and related. A lot of papers on how many pills are left over, that kind of thing. But and then come back in next time prepared to discuss and just open the table and open the floor for recommendations for updates. So does that seem like a decent plan? Greg, what do you think?
I'm happy to do that. I think you're going to find dealing with me difficult.
You think I didn't know that?
I think,
but I love you.
I think that surgeries are different, and I think the more data that's coming out, the more it's clear. And there's actually people, what you described there for my rules, the opioid task force presentation. There were like 16 different demonstrations in the literature, some of which were still in press, not published yet, but talking about how we are overprescribing. And there's no doubt that there's a lot of leftover drugs out there. And, but the question, after you're done admiring the problem, right? 14 different people saying, boy, is this a problem? You got to figure out, well, what are you going to do about that? And not hurt a lot of people that really are asking me, they're still going to give me some pain medicine, aren't they? For my surgery I'm having next week. These are friends that know I do pain, and they're asking me these questions. And so I'm not sure that, I think we need to be very careful that everybody knows that we're trying to make sure people's pain is well controlled. But their pain is not helped by a big bottle of extra pills in the medicine.
So I think I am certain that we've got enough smart people in this group that we can actually solve that problem with some additional, recommendations. So, David?
There's just two things. Your earlier slide about the exempt groups, I didn't see cancer-related pain on your presentation slide for the group. So we should include cancer-related pain. I know cancer survivor pain. It's not listed as.
I believe I think they're intending.
On your slide, it wasn't up there, and they call it
Okay.
cancer pain, and that's ambiguous, we have a separate conversation about different cancer pain, cancer-related pain, because that's a big thorny area.
Right, we're not, that's just, our discussion is, we're talking about perioperative here.
The draft that I read from the DOH, it said acute cancer pain management. So
Acute cancer pain management.
active cancer pain management.
Was included?
That was exempt, but by saying active cancer pain management, it doesn't include the complexities of cancer survivor pain, which is, again, a thorny, complicated issue. So let's discuss that a little bit.
But that actually wouldn't be in the scope of this post-operative thing, but it might be in the scope of the things on the list to discuss when we finish
It's in the
this.
scope of the DOH draft.
Yeah,
So since they're going to be up against.
Blake, did you hear that?
I already got my email comment.
Yeah, you're talking about the exclusions in section 4
I don't have it in front of me.
about active cancer treatment.
Yeah, active cancer treatment. We need some more discussion. We don't have time for that right now, but I just would like to toss that out. We can talk about it offline. And the other is, I did a deep review of Oganas and like, we're talking about long-acting opiates, and we don't even use the word extended-release opiates, and they should be listed too. Okay, good. But we'll have a
So we
separate
talked
conversation.
about what our task is here, on the post-operative, perioperative work, because we got to get this done by March. So,
This would take 30 minutes of conversation.
well, it's fine.
Yeah.
But it's sort of a separate conversation.
But if we're going to inform by March the guidelines, these are not specified, and it's going to be a shock. I like the term. It's going to be a shock if you don't, omission is not including extended release. And if we don't clarify what we mean by active cancer pain management as an exclusion. Active pain management is a very complicated issue as well. So we would.
So you're talking about recommendations that are not related to post-operative, that are related to amending other parts of the 2015 AMDG guideline and making sure that they get it right at the rule level?
Yes, yeah, okay.
Is that right? Is what I just
Yes,
said?
that would be an amendment in our AMDG. If you list on the last slide, there are the other things to do, which is dose limit. I would say, discuss cancer-related pain.
Okay.
Modify that. And also,
I think we did have a section on cancer survivors.
it should be updated.
I think that should be updated also.
Special population, because that's
Okay.
going to be called out by
Okay.
DOH.
I mean, I do think we should clarify somewhere in here, because we have a patient on service this week who's a stage 4 cancer who just had a big operation and came in on opioids, and, I mean, patients who have cancer have surgery. So-
Yeah,
That's active cancer. That's active cancer.
Patients who are long-term cancer survivors who are all still perceived through the lens
Yeah,
of active cancer. That's a whole different.
So, separate discussion, and then the extended release is an omission that we need to fix. Because the
Can you just send a note to the Bree group, to Jenny, so we can get that into record, what you just said? Okay. That would be helpful. Then we can add it, make sure we add it to the minutes. Are we okay with where we're heading here? And so I'm thinking that we're gonna need probably about 3 more meetings like this.
So our next meeting is February. It's a little bit far away. I think we should schedule one for January to kind of reconvene.
I think we definitely need something for January. What do you all think?
No way we're going to get it done.
And we may need,
Deadline.
I'm thinking we need 3 more meetings possibly, if things are going well, maybe not, maybe we don't need all those meetings, I don't know. And see how far we get between now and the next meeting. But the next meeting is really about people throwing stuff up, recommendations. But take a look at the evidence.
2015. Based on the change in literature since 2015.
Based on the change in literature since 2015 to amend what's in the 2015 guideline, right, that's the task.
It would be helpful before the January meeting if we can get the updated draft that the DOH is working with, so we can pick out small things that are easy fixes.
I think these are 2 separate projects,
Yeah.
David. I really do, which is why I'm going to be spending all day in Kent next Tuesday, because it's a different project than what is it next Tuesday?
That's why I made a big deal out of the difference between what we're trying to accomplish and best practices.
The best way
and
to
what
get
ends up
it
in
into the rules is to have me or you bring it up at the rules discussion, or to
right.
get back to Blake.
We want that.
That's what they need.
I gave, Blake, I gave you all this already. I sent it back in my...
But it also matters, you know, I hate to say it, it also matters that you say this stuff in public, that's part of the public record. That's kind of what they have to go through.
And I would agree with you, Gary. I think that it, you know, I would like to sit here and say that each of the members of the task force is going to come in and having read the, you know, probably several hundred pages of feedback they've gotten. And I would like to say that, but I know that's not going to be the case. I know that they're going to do their best, but there are going to be parts of it that they're not going to be able to have gotten to. And I think that the extent that they can hear from you in the meetings, it will help to drive the points home that you want to make.
So, thank you.
Kids will be beautiful on Tuesday.
Do you want me to do the first draft?
Okay.
And we'll see where we're at, and then have these guys chip in. But I do strongly recommend taking a look at these papers. If you think any other papers need to be added, you know, send them to Ginny.
So I gave a talk, it was 15 minutes, and I talked about the literature at the Yakima meeting on the rules. 'Cause I was
Is that on video?
It's not, but it is.
Well, I recorded it.
Oh, there you go.
I do have
did?
the,
I did.
Can you send it to
I
us?
do have the
Yeah.
PowerPoint presentation that I could add audio. I could do it again,
You want to do it at the beginning of the next meeting?
or I could do it at the beginning of the next meeting, or I could send it to you. So
Well, I think if you got the video,
I'll have to piece it together. I mean, it was this level quality and from distance,
it's
but
probably
Why don't you
just as
send the slides?
easy for me to add an audio track to this slide
okay,
presentation.
okay.
Send it to you, and you can tell me what you think of it and whether everybody should see it.
I'm sure it's wonderful.
it was good.
It's got a lot of stuff in it.
You know,
It was good.
We have another minute. I want to respond, because we're off subject, and Greg, my dear friend and colleague here, said this is not the track. I go on record, disagree. We heard clearly that we have an opportunity up till March to be certain DOH rules that are going to include the topics I brought up are up to date. And what I'm suggesting is very simple conversation to make those up to date for mostly clarification.
yeah, but here's the thing. I'm trying to focus our group on getting a product done so that they'll take it seriously. And if we have other things we want to deal with, we can still deal with those. And you can submit anything now to them, as you've heard. But I feel like if it's an AMDG Bree recommendation, and we're going through the process to kind of, you know, amend the 2015 guideline, the most important task right now is to focus on getting that done so that they're certain when they send it to their boards and commissions, it's going to have a lot of weight and a lot of credibility.
I'm agreeing.
So, and that doesn't mean none of this other stuff can happen. It's just that I just want to get this done.
This is periop. The NDG guidelines is more than periop. There's two other little things that we can solve that will be
Just send
relevant
it
to
out,
NDG guidelines.
and we'll put it on the list.
Because I do believe it's on,
Okay.
it's on track with what we're trying to do.
Thank you all very much. I appreciate it. And if you have any recommendations between now and the next time, or if even you have some recommendations, you know, statements that
I
you
guarantee there'll be 5 more papers in the literature.
By the time we shoot. Thank you very